Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming and finding parking or whatever those of you managed to find those elusive spots at the ANU. I'm Mark Matthews. I'd like to start by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians upon whose land we meet and pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. I head up the HC Coombs Policy Forum, which is a joint think tank via which the Australian Public Service and the ANU carry out a range of activities associated with shaping public policy. We have a particular emphasis on doing experimental and exploratory work. We also have a co-production relationship with ABC News 24, so we make a few television programs, the Future Forum TV series being one, a documentary we're making is in the pipeline, so very much trying to contribute to public debate and discourse. And this, I guess, is that type of event. Today's discussion, which we're delighted to have, has been organised and delivered jointly with the John Button Foundation. We've got James Button there, who'll be introduced in a second. And both the Foundation and the Coombs Policy Forum receive funding from the the Federal Government's Department of Innovation, so we'd like to acknowledge that funding. Also like to acknowledge the usually about 3/4 of the audience, I'm not sure if it's like that tonight, are particularly because I'll be introducing a large contingent from Singapore, 3/4 usually from the Australian Public Service, but welcome colleagues from the government too. Really like to thank my colleague Paul Harris over there, Deputy Director of the HC Coombs Policy Forum, who's, if you like, the producer of tonight, put it all together. And Paul will be leaving us soon to become the Education and Science Counsellor in the Australian Embassy in Tokyo, so he'll be a big loss for us, but you'll have fun with those Pachinko machines and everything, so it should be good. Also, I think pretty much this entire side is colleagues from the Singapore government, from the Singapore Civil Service College, doing an advanced management program, and you're very welcome here. I'm known talking to you tomorrow morning, but it's great to see you here, and it's great to fill out the numbers in this way. We should arrange this all the time. So if you'd like to come back next week, we could. So also like to particularly acknowledge Singapore Deputy High Commissioner Teng Ho Chua and Second Secretary Fiona Zhang. I don't know where you're, there you are, you're at the front, yeah, so thank you. Thank you. So that's good. Just to warn you, we are, as you can see, videoing this, so when we come to the Q&A part of the discussion, we'd like you to announce yourselves and please wait for the microphone. If any of you, with hindsight, would like to be edited out, then please go and talk to my colleague on the camera. I've done that myself on a number of occasions, and we'll have you edited out for a small fee. Just to warn you about that. And there are feedback forms. We're funded by government. We really do like to collect large amounts of data to show how interested or disinterested people were in our things like this. So please do fill out the forms, and I can guarantee you'll get a drink if there's a completed form. Welcome to stay for drinks afterwards. So look, the topic for this evening is how government communicates in a complex world. We're all aware of the fact that politics and media move fast. There's that longer term, longer horizon work of government, and this is what goes on in the background, dealing with incredibly complex issues, which seems to, the rhetoric is, get more complex with the globalized world all the time. So a lot of complexity is dealt with behind the scenes. And that raises the challenge of how that complexity can be communicated to the general community and the relationships with the media. There are ways in which we understand geopolitical considerations, demographics, the long-term, the demographic time bomb, equality in the environment. There's our grasp of history, the history of demonstrating those, looking at those problems. You're right, John? And yeah, that's good. Though we like to look after our colleagues from the public service. That long grasp of how we've dealt with that in the past and where we're going in the future is very important. So it does raise the question of how well does the public service communicate that aspect of its work and role? How has the relationship between the public service and the media changed? I mean, a lot of issues there. What does that mean for public understanding and debate of major policy issues? And what role can academics and think tanks play in that space? Just as an aside, I sometimes wonder, I've heard colleagues talk in academia about we need 21st century government to deal with 21st century complexity and problems, and I sometimes wonder whether a more traditional 19th century mode of government, which didn't really bother about transparency and accountability, committees told people what was good for them, the secret services didn't advertise in the press for recruitment, and maybe that would work a bit better sometimes, I think, just as a devil's advocate. Certainly make the life of government easier. Yeah, or 60. Well, that's right.
I don't think we need to do it.
Okay. So we're all in agreement. We can go for drinks. So look, we've got a fantastic panel here tonight. We've got, starting with James over there on my left. So James Button is Communications Manager of the Grattan Institute and a board member of the John Button Foundation. His 2012 book, Speechless, A Year in My Father's Business, describes a period he spent working inside the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and he's a former journalist with the Age newspaper. Katharine Murphy is Deputy Political Editor of The Guardian Australia. There's a thing in England, people talk about Guardian readers as a particular type of person and demographic. We can now be Guardian readers in Australia, so that's good. Katharine's been reporting on federal politics for more than a decade. In 2008, she won the Paul Lynham Award for Excellence in Press Gallery Journalism, and in 2012, she was a Hockley Award finalist for the Best Digital Journalism category for a politics blog. So, that's good. Michael Wesley, my colleague over there on the right, is Professor of National Security at the Australian National University. On the extreme right, self-defined, so 14th century. He's a career that spanned academia with previous appointments in the University of New South Wales, Griffiths, the University of Hong Kong, Sun Sat Sen University and the University of Sydney. Government, where he worked as Assistant Director General of Transnational Issues at the Office of National Assessments, and obviously, as all of you know, he was Executive Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy for quite some time, which is a very prestigious and effective think tank based in Sydney, and is a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Michael, your book, There Goes the Neighbourhood, won the Button Foundation Prize in 2012. I've got these not in 1912, 2012. So 1412, that's right. So Andrew Hockley is Executive Coordinator of Strategic Policy in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. I should stress that Andrew is here speaking in a personal capacity. That's good, and I'll stress that again whenever you nudge me. But Andrew's background combines a mixture of senior roles in the public and private sector, having served as Commercial Director of the Sun Herald in Melbourne. Herald Sun. I'm slightly dyslexic, Herald Sun. And before that, as Director of Strategic Communications in the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet. Andrew describes his current role as working at the intersection of policy, implementation and communication in the Australian Public Service. He's got a degree in econometrics and statistics, and, as I said, speaking very much in a personal capacity here tonight. So if you could welcome the panellists, and we'll kick off. So the way we'll kick off with a bit of a debate, bit of a discussion amongst the panellists, and then I'll start to open out to the audience. So stick your hand up, and we'll, if you want to, once I sort of indicate that we're ready to go to that phase, and please announce who you are, and if you regret it afterwards, to say have yourself edited out. But wait for the microphone before you ask your question, otherwise it won't come through. And as I said to the panellists earlier on, we're not going to do like a television thing where we cut people off rather brutally. We'll do it in a bit more relaxed way, so hopefully that works. I'm going to start off with James. So James, you've recently written a fascinating book about the policy, politics and communication nexus, and you focused on the important role of the public service in all of this. What has writing your book and the response to it, which was quite interesting, what has that taught you about these issues?
Thanks, Mark. Look, I think something that I learnt in Canberra when I worked here in 2009, 2010, it's perhaps a very obvious thing, but I learnt it quite intensely, is the importance of telling stories in politics and policy, and how complex ideas have to be made simple in order to grip people. And to be made simple and to grip people, there must be something behind them, there must be something important in them. I was very affected while I was here by a speech that Ken Henry gave in 2007 to the Curtin Policy Forum. It's got a very dry title, Challenges for Policy Advisors. But I urge you, if you haven't read it, I urge you all to do so. In this speech, Ken Henry says that how you communicate the message as a public servant to your minister or to the public at large, how you communicate your message is as important as the message itself, how it's constructed. And he gives the example, quite a provocative example, of Australia in the 1980s, when it had a vast economic challenge. The government at that time really transformed Australia with a series of major policy changes. And Henry contends that the way that story was told was critical to the success of those reforms being adopted by the public. And he says there are other countries where reforms just as ambitious and just as important were put forward but failed because the story was told badly. Now, what interests me is whether in 2013 it would still be possible for a government, and not just the government, but all the other people around who told that story about the need for economic reform, public servants, academics, journalists, business people. There was a kind of consensus around some of those things. The opposition supported the reforms. Does that climate still exist in Australia today if we had a really big reform that we wanted to?
Andrew, are you well positioned to maybe build on that, comment on that?
Look, I think that James has a point about storytelling. I think the power of being able to engage people with stories that convey your sense of values, what you're trying to achieve as a leader, and the sorts of things that are important to you and how you prioritise. And bear in mind, I mean, politics, government, a wise man once said to me, he was a minister in the Hawke government actually, and not your father, that politics is the art of allocating scarce resources among competing ends. And that if you keep that in mind and understand that really it's all about making choices and conveying not just what the choice is, but why you've made that choice, and accept and acknowledge that there will be winners and losers, then you're halfway towards, I think, having an adequate communication strategy, because you've understood some of the basics of what you're dealing with at a human level. But I think really it's very hard to go past this notion that if you're going to communicate something and be effective at it, you've got to start with a good product. And the process of policy making will always, I guess, be the starting point for all of this, because a rubbish policy is not going to get any better with great communication. It's just a good communication is just going to sink it quicker.
Yeah.
So before I come to Michael, Katharine, did you want to say something about that?
It's interesting. It's certainly, I mean, James, I think, raises the point about partisanship and increasing partisanship, and that's certainly one factor that we will have all observed, certainly over this Parliament. He also raises storytelling, which I agree, I think is essential to the art of politics. And great storytelling is basically grounded in values and belief. But I don't think we can analyse this problem as simply a failure of storytelling. I think the means by which politics has been able to tell stories has radically changed, and changed in a very short period of time. So you sort of have great storytellers, and I would rate Bob Hawke and Paul Keating as great storytellers about public policy. Then you have, I suppose, I mean, no disrespect to John Howard, but a more pedestrian storyteller who has the means of controlling his message. Because when John Howard was the Prime Minister, the media cycle had not yet fragmented. And John Howard and people who work for John Howard, particularly Arthur Sinodinos, who I would rate as one of the great kind of inside political staffers, certainly in my career as a journalist, had a real talent for being able to control their messaging and also stand still in the media cycle and advocate points. And I think the thing that's changed fundamentally for Kevin Rudd and for Julia Gillard, although you know, they had a number of deficiencies as communicators, but the radical change has been the fragmentation of the media cycle, and the difficulties that imposes for politicians, I think, are immense.
Okay. Just turn to you, Michael. I mean, you've recently written a book about geostrategic changes in Asia and implications for Australia, which is the prize-winning book I mentioned. One of the stories that's been told over the last year or so, the lead is the Asian Century White Paper, the federal white paper. How effective do you think that was? What have you learned from that experience?
I think I think the Asian Century White Paper is a classic example of just how difficult strategic communication is in the current environment, as James and Katharine and Andrew have been talking about. On the one hand, I think it came out of a desire for a Prime Minister who was seen not to have a narrative, to try and develop a narrative. And I think she chose it quite cleverly. I've written before that Asia has always been the talisman of vision and foresight and big plans for the future in Australian politics. So she chose that well. And I think in a lot of ways she was rewarded by what was really an outpouring of interest from Australian society. You know, the number of submissions that PM&C got of people and their vision for what Australia in the Asian century should be. So on that level, I think they did reasonably well. But there are so many different audiences that you have to keep in mind. I was in Tokyo in March this year, and a very senior Japanese diplomat came up to me, a long-time watcher of Australia. He was ambassador here in Canberra in the 1990s, and he said, "What the hell were you doing," meaning Australia, "in putting out a white paper with this title?" He said, "This fails in the region because of the title alone, Australia and the Asian century." He said, "This rhetorically puts Australia outside of Asia. You guys have been trying to convince us Asians that you're part of the region for 30 years, and all of a sudden you come out and say Australia and the Asian century." He said, "Australia is part of the rise of Asia." He said, "Look around Tokyo, look around Shanghai, look around Beijing, and see how much of those cities would have been built without Australian iron ore and Australian minerals and Australian energy." And similarly, you walk around Sydney or Melbourne or even Canberra and you have a look at what Asia has contributed to the rise of modern Australia. You know, in fact, this is not what he said, but I'd say, and apologies to anyone I offend, if you want to see what Australia would have been like without Asian demand for what we produce, just go to New Zealand. That's the level of standard of
just
living.
scanning the room quickly.
We might cut that out of the video tape.
Can't cut you out.
No, that's not the deal.
But, you know, so Australia is part of the Asian century, and Asia is part of modern Australia, and simply saying that Australia somehow is on the sidelines and looking to make money out of this big economic bonanza is exactly the wrong. So I would judge it all ends up as a big strategic communication failure if that's the effect it's had on the region that's so important.
So just come back on that before, Andrew, if you want to come back on this, Andrew, but was the strategic intent misconceived, or was it executed? Did it go wrong in execution?
Look, Andrew can probably tell us who came up with the title.
In a personal capacity.
And in fact, I might go and get a bottle of red wine and we can just pour it down his throat. But I don't know who came up with the title, but the title is a failure, I think. And I don't think it sent the right messages. I think it's got a whole lot of people excited, and this is something I'd kind of like to get to later. It got a whole lot of people excited and then failed to deliver because there was nothing in the paper about how we're actually going to get there. Lots of big objectives, very little detail on how we're going to get there.
Do you want to comment?
Oh, look, where do I start?
Personally?
No, well, focus groups of one are always very risky, and I guess for every conversation you can have about the deficiencies of the plan, I know that there were plenty of people who thought it was a good one. The issues with language and translations are always going to be fraught, and as you'd be aware, there was quite a lot of translations and back translations done in the dead of night of the paper itself, and it seemed to pass muster as far as I'm concerned. I'm not especially close to that piece of work, so that's good. From the point of view of this discussion at least anyway. But I guess there's a couple of points that emerge from what Michael said, and that is, first of all, I'm never quite sure what strategic communication is. I've had it on my business card over the years, and I guess as an observation I'd say that one of the real deficiencies, and this is something I think Dr. Watt would probably let me say in a semi-official capacity on behalf of PM&C, there is a view that I think has emerged in recent times that strategy is not something government and not something public servants do particularly well. And if you don't start with a really clear and single-minded set of objectives as to what you are intending to do and why you are intending to do it, and articulate that as much internally as externally, then any strategy that tries to join up that objective with the outcome is going to be difficult from the start. So I guess my mantra is that the communications are really easy. Communicating is really easy when you've got a very clear objective. Strategies just fall out of it, of a really clear set of objectives. So in the sense that I've sort of said something that kind of aligns with what you've said, I agree with you, Michael, but obviously I'm not talking specifically about the Asian Century White Paper.
Thanks. James?
Just a couple of quick comments about the Asian Century. The title, it's Australia focused though, yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, and so in a sense, you had to have a title that was going to play here. And this goes to the difficulty of different audiences and fragmentation. My other quick comment is perhaps we were more confident 20 years ago about getting closer to Asia than we are now. So for some reasons, I'm not sure if there's a lack of confidence in that title, it's because something has changed and put us further away.
It's a great point. I mean, the American strategic commentator George Kennan once compared democracies to dinosaurs. So you've got this great big, powerful, buffy body and a brain the size of a pea. And you can hit it on the tail and it won't react. But once the pea gets hit in a particular way by domestic politics, then the whole rest of it goes after it. And I think, this is an issue that Australian governments have wrestled with. They say one thing to a domestic audience, and John Howard did this as much as Julia Gillard did, and it plays extremely badly in the region. And I think one of the things that has allowed them to do it is the fact that they think, that the countries to our north will just forget about it over time, and they'll forgive us over time. And I'm not sure that's going to be the case for too much longer.
Katharine, did you want to?
Well, it's sort of interesting, this sort of evolution with Australia's relationship with key countries in the region and the politics therein. I think it's true, it's certainly right that engagement with Asia is this kind of political talisman. It is this plus which Kevin Rudd used very effectively, as we all know, in his transition to being the Prime Minister. But there is this heightened concern about foreign direct investment, about relationships with China, and we've also seen some of the sensitivities around the Indonesia relationship with the whole debate we've had about asylum seekers over the last couple of weeks, where the Indonesians have been drawn in directly to Australia's political debate, and it's sort of been rather excruciating to witness their discomfort being in the middle of that. So in a way we're more integrated than we've ever been. I think if we've got the Indonesian Foreign Minister standing with Bob Carr doing the 10 late news, together, it's sort of like, whoa.
Being verbal by both sides.
Well, I'm glad you said that. But at another level, there are these sort of increasing sensitivities and concerns that are very difficult for both of the major parties to manage, because you see sensitivities between various people in the coalition and also within Labor about these things. It's quite difficult.
I was struck by, Andrew, your point is that it's easy to, I think if I can paraphrase, easy to communicate a good, clear strategy. Sure. But I think we've got a tail wagging the dog situation where people think communication can make up for a strategy deficit.
Absolutely.
And, just put another agenda item on the table. I'd like to move towards opening things up, but that agenda item, I think we've got to talk about social media and that aspect of the, we now have some public servants basically running tweets on evidence, trying to shape discourse and things like this. There's a little old reactionary conservative in my head that hates that stuff, but is it a force for the good, Katharine? Or?
Oh, well, look, I'm very positive about social media, although part of my brain thinks it's also the end of civilization, and which answer I give you will depend on how visceral my day on social media has been. It cannot be ignored. That's the bottom line. I'm a bit like a politician in the sense that I'm in a profession that is sort of enduring this quite profound structural adjustment. My audiences are fragmenting. And so I sort of have a certain amount of sympathy with politicians because to some extent I'm in their world. It's a very profound societal change. I actually wrote an essay for Meanjin about my own experience in this sort of world. Which was quite an interesting thing to sort of try and pull together. No, look, there is an audience on Twitter and Facebook. I think I've got about 15,000 followers. It's a means where you can communicate directly to an audience, and I think that's why we've seen public servants enter this sphere, why we've seen politicians enter this sphere. But it's not. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that because we're engaging with an audience on social media that we're suddenly engaged with Australia as a whole. Because there's a lot of research, obviously, that Twitter in particular skews left, and I think that would be pretty consistent with my own experience in that medium. And I think Facebook is certainly very youth-oriented. There's a lot of kids, as we would all know in this room, who are very active Facebookers. Look, it's an irresistible audience. It's not a representative audience. It's the space that politics has to inhabit and come to terms with. But it is, as I've said, also the end of civilisation at the same time. So,
but once we get used to it, when it just gets factored in the share price and it won't really shaping things anymore. I mean, there's concern about the social amplification of risk. Is that I think was one of the Blair government reports looked at the role that the media. I think it was the Frankenstein Foods, the GM stuff, is the way that the media amplified the sense of risk, and there's that kind of here and now discourse all the time.
Oh, of course. Well, it's the crowd, and you get the wisdom and the non-wisdom of the crowd, and that's essentially where it is. It also heightens this sense because social media runs now in parallel with the news cycle and the breaking news cycle, and I'm a practitioner in the breaking news cycle with my live politics blog. When I'm writing that, I update every 10 minutes. Yes, feel sorry for me, thank you.
Just a break, what are you doing?
Well, no, exactly. But it's sort of, one amplifies the other. So there is this sense that is created by social media and by 24/7 news that nothing settles, that everything is permanently moving. And I think that loops us back into this general discussion about reform and whether or not you can do reform anymore. And I'm actually an optimist on that front. But anyway, there is this sense of nothing settling. And that's largely, driven by social media and by 24/7 news.
James?
Yeah, I think, Katharine, would be really rich to pick up what you said earlier on about fragmentation and the role of fragmentation in helping or hindering policy and government stories to be told. I'm really struck, if you think of Julia Gillard's misogyny speech, the separation between, forgive me if I caricature the two sides, but the press gallery was seen as taking generally a very critical position on her speech, that it was a misstep, that she said misogyny when she should have said sexist, and that she'd really got it wrong. And then 2 million people watched the YouTube video in 10 days. So it opened up this sense of two different worlds looking at this speech. But what you didn't have, and this is where we've lost something, is in the past, and I don't sound like it was great in the old days, but you would have had a good newspaper would have looked at that and said, okay, let's go out and find out who these 2 million people are. Where are they in Australia? Are they overseas? And if they're in Australia, who are they? Are they young women? Let's go to some schools or some workplaces and interview people and try and make sense of this divide that seems to have opened up about Gillard's speech. I didn't see that. Did I miss it?
No, James, you didn't miss it. I think the press gallery reaction, although I of course would argue that it wasn't monolithic.
No, and I'm not saying it is.
It wasn't. Yeah. There were different pieces written about the speech on the day, which has sort of been a bit lost in the wash. Yeah. But I think what the press gallery did on the day is what the press gallery does, which is provide the context around the speech. The fact is that Julia Gillard's misogyny speech happened on a day where the government, yet another day, where the government was literally fighting for its life, where there was another development around Peter Slipper that posed an existential threat to the government's survival. And the press gallery perhaps erred on the side of providing too much context and not enough emotion in terms of the response to the speech. But anyway, I was there, I reported it. That's my perceptions of it.
Okay, thanks. We'll just stick for a quick round off the social media. Andrew, do you want to comment?
Oh, well, you could really devote a whole evening and then some to social media, I guess. But, I mean, the challenge for government communicators in the social media space is to have something useful to say that people actually want to tune into. And also, obviously, around the various different people who do tweet on behalf of the government, on behalf of different departments, you know, the management of risk, given that you're in an immediate world and there are people listening to everything you say and you're an individual and you don't have approval processes and well, you don't have many approval processes, is one of the great dilemmas that government continues to grapple with. I think, you know, we'll work through it as an organisation, but it will take some time because it's the very immediacy of social media that represents the challenge to government at both an internal and an external level, and I don't think it's an easy thing for government to solve because we have traditionally put a choke on outbound communications.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, and I think because that continues to be the traditional way that we operate in a fairly risk-averse manner, then social media does represent a real challenge because you're not necessarily equipped to fight with, you know, both hands in front of you, you know, when things start flying around. Mind you, I'm not sure the Twitter sphere skews left. I think it just skews stupid most days, but that's just my prejudice. Yeah. Well, it depends on who you sort of tune into, and maybe I follow the wrong people.
Michael,
yeah, it gives it a fake quality, a bit like Philip Rudd wearing jeans, doesn't it? Government communication on this. But I think, you know, that there's a much bigger challenge for government, and this brings it back to reform. I think there were two campaigns, one in 2007 and one in 2008, that showed what effect social media is going to have on government. The first was the Kevin 07 campaign, the other one was Obama. Both of these men rode to power in very unlikely circumstances on a wave of huge public optimism because they sketched big messages, big reform messages, big change messages. And they were able to do this through social media. And they were able to dominate the fragmented social media cycles doing it. Problem was, when both of them came to office, Rudd more so than Obama, when they came to office, they realised just how difficult it was to deliver on any of these big reform agenda items, let alone all of them together, particularly when their opponents had access to exactly the same tools, social media tools, as they had had. And so we had the Tea Party movement against Obama, and we had the carbon tax movement against Rudd, just as the work choices movement against Howard had brought him down. And I think what it's led to in Australia has been a colossal loss of confidence in government, a colossal cynicism and a colossal pessimism about government that it's going to be really hard collectively to lift ourselves from.
Well, that's a nice segue to where I think we want to end up, which is what do we do about it and how do we move forward from this kind of state that we've got ourselves in? James, any ideas?
Oh, thank you, Mark.
Well, you were smiling at me.
Yeah, all right. How do we move forward?
How do we get some momentum?
Look, I think part of it is adjusting to the new world. It's a new world that has appeared very quickly, and people are still not comfortable moving in it. Over time, I think, and it's not the Twitter sphere is Twitterverse is part of it, but it's just about politicians in part growing comfortable with the 24/7 and being able to get beyond the sort of robotic responses that we often see under such intense and often quite hostile media scrutiny. That's one thing. I think I go back to what Katharine said at the start. How the world is fragmented, I think we haven't yet the consequences for that, for telling government stories, for communicating policy, is really complicated and difficult, and it's going to take a lot of time to nut out because of just the different audiences problem, the different media problem, who's listening out there. You know, I don't have an easy answer to that at all.
One thing that strikes me is that, and we will move to questions soon, is that we've got a tendency, we have people imagine about wicked problems, incredibly complex, intractable problems that governments grapple with, that quite frankly, in most cases, they actually can't do much about. And rather than saying we ought to learn to live with this problem, we have a very adversarial type of political discourse that says, vote for me, I'll do X, I'll fix X. This notion of it's like your carburettor or something like that. The relationship between ministers' offices and departments is not the frank and fearless, I'm told situation that it used to be. If we went a bit, coming back to my more old-fashioned view of these things, does the bureaucracy have more of a role to play in holding back ministers from, or political discourse in the opposition, is actually saying, misleading people, saying, we can fix really complex problems? Should we be spelling out the complexity and the intractability, and how is that wise, or does it make people feel depressed?
Well, you assume the bureaucracy doesn't spell out the difficulties, and obviously it does.
It does, yeah.
I think the reality is that one of the things that politicians as a category are not particularly good at doing, and the bureaucracy is not particularly good at encouraging, but is getting better, is this question of prioritisation. There are only so many things you can do with the resources that you've got, and if you keep your eye focused on this notion that it is all about allocating scarce resources among competing ends, then the difficulty is, the problem that you're solving is allocating the right amount of resources to the problems that need most urgently to be fixed in order for society to move forward in the directions that you want to go. And not trying to create and engineer situations where everyone's a winner. I mean, my kids go to a school where, they have running races and they all get a ribbon, and I'm not sure that it's actually, that's really the way it's supposed to be. But that's the kind of society that somehow or other the media, politicians, a general lack of discipline or something, I'm not entirely sure what it is, has engineered, where we think that it's bad to say, I'm sorry, but we've made some choices and you're not going to get that school or that swimming pool or that hospital because there's other more pressing needs that we can demonstrate.
I mean, there's this weird thing now that it's a bit like engineering. You have to make what engineers call design trade-offs. You favour A over B, but we're supposed to not really do that with our demographics and our constituencies. That's very tricky. I'm just going to carry on the session, but I'd like to line up some questions from the audience. There's one at the back there. So who's got the mics? If you could pre-position. Joshua, there's one at the back there. So we'll take one more. I mean, Michael, did you want to comment on that? Katharine?
I do, actually. I'm going to be Pollyanna for a moment, and I'm going to say that I know we're interrogating some of the problems associated with public policy making here in this session, and they are profound problems. I would add, though, can I just say that as a voter and a consumer, that I'm amazed we have a carbon price in Australia. Right? The government achieved that. They implemented that, despite all of the obstacles to doing it. Can I also say, as a voter and a citizen, that I'm profoundly glad that both the major parties in Australia have stretched their hands over the dispatch box and agreed to work together to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution, despite the fact that there are powerful interests against that reform. So yes, the last period of the Labor government has seen a number of deficiencies, some terrible face plants, some terrible kind of failure to deliver on hopes, but I'm not prepared to say that the Reform Compact in this country is broken. I don't think it is. I think there's a lot of challenges in the system at the moment, some of which, as James says, we're only really starting to come to terms with in terms of communication. But I'm seriously amazed that anything gets done. And when it gets done, I'm prepared to just stand back and say, well, I'm glad that happened.
That's good. That's a good note to open things up. There's a question at the back, and then after that, if you can pass the mic forward, there's someone else further down. Thanks. Could you check that the microphone's on? I'm not sure, is it?
Damien Madison from DEWA. Views of my own. I just want to go back to the social media conversation, and I think, I'm not sure if this is a solution or not, but perhaps I'd suggest that maybe the problem that we've identified here, trying to find a solution, might be the wrong problem. We talked about, you know, talking about social media is equal to use of Facebook and Twitter, I think is very limiting to start with. But, you know, the problems that we've identified are those problems of controlling a message in those mediums with a fragmented audience. I think, to me, social media is more than just controlling the message. It's more than just putting stuff out there. Social, to me, means actually a two-way conversation. And I don't think we ever get sort of as far into this conversation to be looking at how do we facilitate or how do we empower people to have that conversation. You see, you know, you can go into mainstream news, you can look at comments, you can see quite vibrant conversations happening, differences of opinion, different perspectives and so forth. But, and I'm aware that now there's more and more technologies that are enabling that more collaborative platform for that conversation. Not so much, maybe more than communication, but collaboration. I wonder if there might be some merit in looking at sort of identifying a platform or a technology that we can standardise that, that conversation platform. So that rather than, you know, and I'm talking about the APS here, I think, you know, government departments, if there was a standardised way that you could have a platform, a place, whether that's GovBook or whatever you want to call it, where, you know, you can go to it, you're familiar with the interface, like as people become more and more familiar with using Twitter, more and more Facebook and so forth, perhaps looking at identifying that standardised, consistent platform so that if you want to talk about different issues, you know, you can log into the same thing, you've got the same interface, you can put material, stimulus material, people can answer, respond, follow, track and so forth. If that was a standardised way of doing that, I wonder if there's any merit in that.
Thanks for that. Andrew, do you have any thoughts?
The IT world is littered with good ideas like that, Damien. I'm not opposed to what you're saying. I think the focus of the sort of idea that you're proposing would do almost irreparable good to the public service if it was trained on encouraging people to, within the public service, to speak to each other. Because that is, I mean, I've been in the Commonwealth Public Service for 2.5 years. I spent 7 years in the Victorian Public Service. The biggest single problem of the bureaucracy is getting people from different parts of the bureaucracy to speak to each other. So if that was the principal objective of what you're suggesting, then I'd say bring it on tomorrow. But for everything else, I'd say keep the IT consultants out of it and let 1,000 flowers bloom. If I can just add one bit of one insight, which is data, and I'm a data kind of person.
Yeah,
I did bring this big thick set of aid memoirs with me, and you were horrified that I was going to give a presentation. Yeah. But just for the sake of aligning the argument to some real changes that have occurred in the last 20 years. In 1990, there were 5 TV channels in Australia. In 2012, there were 141. In 1990, there were 112 radio stations broadcasting across Australia. In 2012, there were 256. In 1990, there was no pay TV. In 2012, 33% of people watch pay TV. And on it goes. In 1990, there were 660 cinema screens. There are now 2,000 in Australia. The only medium that has gone down in terms of the number of outlets are newspapers. They've gone down from 530. Oh, sorry, no, in 2012 they've gone up to 640, but there's forecast to go down. We didn't have the internet, and there are even more magazines today than there were 20 years ago, nearly twice as many. It's not so much that the audience has fragmented, because essentially Australians, in my view, continue to have roughly predictable views about things and roughly sort of comparable values about big ideas and big issues. We are still basically, you know, a country that has a social contract with each other in broad terms. We lament some of the stuff around the edges, but I think we're basically a reasonably homogeneous society. What's fragmenting is are the ways of reaching each other. And I think to your point, Damien, there is no way that we're going to set up any kind of platform that enables everybody to talk to government in a consistent way or through a hub. But I do think there's a very strong argument for trying to get government to act as one organisation from time to time. That'd be a real novelty in my view.
And of course, some governments do a lot of scanning of the what's going on there in various ways and picking up signals. Katharine, any comments?
It's a really fascinating idea, actually, and you're absolutely right. That's the kind of revolution of social, is that it's a two-way street and it's a community, and that's been a real shock to media organisations. And in my view, the media organisations who get that will be the ones that survive this transition, and the media organisations who think that you can just disdain your audience and not interact with them, well, they'll go the way of the dinosaurs. In terms of how you communicate in that forum, though, I'd just say a couple of things. I love what we call it the Guardian below the line, right? I spend a lot of my time below the line, commenting to readers and also communicating with readers via social media and through other means. One of the challenges I would think for government in setting up some sort of a communication vehicle like that is certainly things that grate with me, because I have a real commitment to trying to communicate with an audience, and that being a virtuous circle. Things that are quite difficult if you're a stakeholder communicating is that you get a lot of anonymous communication coming at you. You get people making comments, you don't know who they are they an activist, are they associated, do they have undeclared associations, all of those sorts of things. So I think this is the difficulty, right? If people are really interested in that grassroots conversation with stakeholders, be they politicians, be they media, be they people with, who hold positions in society, I think it's incumbent on us to embrace that and not hide behind anonymity, not fail to declare, where you come from. Then you'll get free and flowing discourse. Although, I imagine it. Just logistically, I can't imagine how government would actually manage that in terms of the volume of it. But I think it's a really fascinating idea.
Thank you. Yeah, but so say prison does it pretty well. So,
well,
next question.
Let's see if it works. Tom Worthington, I'm one of those computer consultants to government. It turns out the Australian government does have an online platform for public servants to communicate with each other and with state and local government and other countries called GovDex.
Yes, they don't use it.
They don't use it, and there's a bit of a story behind that. The question I ask is, when will public servants get routine training in online communication? I attended a session at the Department of Finance to teach public servants how to work online, and it seemed to be a bit of a novelty to them. I teach master's students here at the ANU via the internet. It takes 3 weeks around about for the students to get used to how to do this online, including the public servants. So it's something, it doesn't come naturally. They need to be taught how to do it. Is this going to be a normal part of public service training?
Thanks. Andrew.
Look, there's just so many different issues in what you're saying, and I am of the view that there is certainly the need for us being the Australian Public Service, to invest in a cultural shift to engaging with communities that matter. I think the people who are most important in that debate are not communications people at all, but policy people, for whom social media represents a unique opportunity to reach out and actually have real dialogue instead of faux consultations with people that they should be talking to and listening to and sharing ideas with, and having those honest discussions about winners and losers at the starting point when policies get made.
Thanks. Any other question there, and then at the front here? Just pop down, Kerry. No, Joshua. Just there. No, it's at the back first, and then.
Thank you. Richard Burgess from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. We have a big social media presence, and it's great. But I want to steer away from social media for a second and go back to your data about the number of television stations increasing, the number of radio stations increasing, number of newspapers hovering around about the same. But has the content improved? Are we getting the same amount of content or more content than ever before? I know I can go to one journalist and cover 3 different newspapers, for example. Now I go to Fairfax.
Oh, that's a fair point.
And I'm getting the same information across 3 different papers. Yeah. Saves on my media monitoring heaps, but am I getting better content?
It's dreadful. It's dreadful, isn't it? It is. It's like being a polar bear on an ice sheet. It's dreadful. I'm not going to sit on this panel and defend increasing concentration, not for one moment. And I think newspapers are obviously producing or pursuing, they're looking for cost savings, and they're consolidating content, and they're running content over more mastheads. It's part of, it's not quite as simple as straight cost saving. There is a rationale to it. And in terms of newspapers, obviously we're moving away from print to digital. And in order to do that, we're creating a news agency model, not a masthead model, if that makes sense. So there is this consolidation across the board that just reflects what we're doing now, which is delivering content, more content online, and sadly, tragically, the mastheads will eventually fall away in their print forms. So there is a rationale for doing it. There's also just crude economics behind it. In terms, Australia obviously has one of the most concentrated media markets in the developed world. I think that is a massive public policy failure. I think in terms of the outlook, though, again, I'm going to be Pollyanna. If we're not dead at the end of this cycle, and we may well be, there is no more exciting time to be a journalist than now. We are thoroughly reinventing what we're doing. And some of the things that are happening in the blogosphere, in independent media, are genuinely exciting and groundbreaking. And if we can make this transition, you'll get a better product.
Thanks, Katharine. Front here.
My name's Ashley Samaris. I'm a user-centred designer in the public service, and therefore I naturally believe that collaboration with the public is key to good policy formulation and implementation. But I'd like to know your opinion on, when it's done well, how does that influence policy implementation for the better?
Good question. Michael, you've been...
Sorry, when
yep.
Just...
So when, collaboration done well, so not just consultation with a few people in the public, when collaboration is done well with the public, when you're formulating policy, how does that affect policy implementation? So we talked a bit about communication at the start.
Look, I mean, I guess, you know, with any, in the current environment, with any consultation, you'll always get fragmented views coming in. I think there was a great book written a few years back by a guy called Cass Sunstein, who said that with the new media, basically people can choose what news they want to read. And it means they don't have to be confronted by alternative points of view. They can read all day opinions that they agree with. And Sunstein worries that it will bifurcate, you know, the reading public, so you'll get extremes. And I think there are signs of that in the current situation. So ongoing consultation, I think, could you know, end up in a cacophony with, you know, very, very entrenched positions basically disagreeing with each other. You know, take the climate change debate, or lack of debate, as an example. I actually think that the solution in all of this is for governments to focus back on a simplicity of message and a simplicity of what they're here for, and not try and be all things to all people. Absolutely. And not try and cure all ills in society and say, this is the role for government, this is what we believe in, and this is what we will deliver.
I think, I think collaboration, that's where collaboration comes in, because collaborating with the public, they'll drive what they want. So it's not the politicians saying, we should focus on these three big issues. It's the public deciding on what we spend our money on.
And sometimes solutions to really big issues, government doesn't have a role in. I know it's a shock horror thing for Australians to hear,
Yeah.
but there are societies who rely to a greater extent on civil society to do this sort of thing. And I think one of the problems here in Australia is we rely on government to do too much.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll just move the mic back to the back there. Thank you. We've probably just got time for one, possibly two more questions, given we started late. So we've got one lined up. Is there one more somewhere else? No? Oh, yeah. Okay. So if we could be as brief as possible, we can fit two in. Thank you.
I'll try. Cassandra Johnson from the Clean Energy Regulator. I guess I've got a question about communicating about communications. So a lot of the work that we do in our team is about trying to sell the message about communicating the message to our internal clients and our internal stakeholders. And I guess I was just interested in your insights. Everybody seems to think that they know what communications is and they know how to communicate. But it really is a specialist skill. And so I guess I was just interested in finding out how you guys would go about selling communications internally before you can actually begin to sell the message externally.
Andrew?
James was pretty keen on that one.
Okay.
Sure. I think what Andrew said earlier is right. You've got to have a message to communicate first, critically. But when you do, I think it's really, this is where we can go back to some time-honoured things. It's about finding out what it is. You know, if you're in an elevator, you know, and you have 30 seconds to give your message to a very important person, or 60 seconds, what would you say? You know, what is the one line that is most important, given that people's attention span is limited, and to use that line to structure your whole document and communications around that, and then to, you know, be absolutely ruthless about driving jargon and technical fuzzery out of your work.
Careful, you're in a university.
Yeah, right, okay. But speaking a human language to people in government, you know, there's this fight all the time to make the language sound like human beings. It's so important. We who have been in government or are in government, you know, don't think about that nearly enough. It just, if you want to talk to people, you've got to speak in the language of people.
Thanks. Andrew, quickly.
Just very quickly on that. I mean, on the climate change topic in particular, there's a piece of research that if you're not familiar with, you ideally should be, called Six Americas, which has been replicated in Australia as well by Charles Sturt University, which identifies the various different cohorts of society based on their views around climate change, their beliefs around climate change, and what it means for communicators. Up one end, you've got people who think climate change is a crock, and up the other end, you've got people who think it's a holy writ. It's about 10-15% at either end. In the middle, 20% of people are completely disengaged. Until you understand who you are talking to and what the various different components of society are and why you would want to talk to each of those different components and what you could hope to achieve, my answer to most of these situations is why bother? Don't do anything. What are you trying to achieve? Save your money. Or save the taxpayers' money.
Thank you. Last question was there. Yep. I know we need it for the recording though, so yeah. Thanks.
I'm just wondering, one of the core services government provides is security of the nation. And in real time, the use of social media in national emergencies. So, for instance, in Japan, and I'm aware that on Twitter, people were aware of the tsunami 45 seconds before it even hit. So, what's the role of social media in providing that service for government, communicating that service to its citizens? And the second point is, in a complex world, how do we communicate with government when it gets caught up mainly in bureaucracy? And the alternative is an age-old writing to your minister, your local member. And again, how are we heard when governments usually turn to polling?
Perhaps look at that, Michael.
Look, I think it's one of the most exciting frontiers for social media. It's not only people getting advance notice of things like the Fukushima disaster, it's also new ways of coordinating aid efforts. So when a huge disaster hits, let's take for example Haiti, and you have just the aid community just descending on it and chaos ensuing, these social media platforms are a good way and a very quick way for them to coordinate what's going on and to fill gaps. So it's an enormously positive and fruitful frontier.
Providing the telecommunications network's still working.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. So that's the first part. There's the second part, but I think we'll...
How to communicate to government.
Yes. I think we'll probably just give you another time, if it's all right, we'll just kind of wrap things up. I'd like to thank you all for coming and thank the panellists and